Hey everyone, have you ever experienced rubber banding in a Mario Kart game? That is, where the CPU difficulty seems to dynamically adjust based on your performance to keep races close? Rubber banding can be frustrating at the best of times, but I read some particularly disturbing reports of how rubber banding was implemented for Mario Kart World, with some people claiming that CPU performance adjusts primarily based on how often you drift and how often you trick, and that you can actually make races easier on yourself by abstaining from drifting and tricking. Could such an outlandish claim actually be true? I took it upon myself to dive into this and pull out some real measurements in the hope of answering this question once and for all. Does avoiding drifts and tricks actually make it easier to place in first? Let's jump in and look at the results. Let's get this out of the way. My findings are limited to the data I had the patience to manually collect on my own. Thus, the bias of small sample sizes is bound to be present here. And of course, Mario Kart inherently has a ton of luck and random variation, in particular with items obtained and used, especially by CPUs. There will also be some variation based on my own play from trial to trial. So while I still believe the data I collected allows us to draw some useful conclusions, by no means can we state anything as absolute fact. To help eliminate the variance from my own play, I wanted to do my testing on a single track in Grand Prix, one that is relatively simple, assuming I don't attempt obscene shortcuts, one that does not contain water, which I do not drive consistently on, and one that has ample opportunities both for drifting and tricking. I settled on Moo Moo Meadows for my tests. It is the first track of the Lightning Cup, meaning I was able to access it quickly, and I was able to race the track again and again with very similar lines and performance. So how was I going to set up this experiment? In one condition, I decided to do 10 races, or trials, each of me on 150cc, racing normally, and in the second condition, I did another 10 trials of me racing without drifting or tricking. I would try to drive the same line as consistently as possible from trial to trial, although I did allow myself to deviate from my line slightly to dodge items. If I made a substantial mistake, such as crashing into a cow, I would restart and not count that trial, although this didn't happen many times, thankfully. To reduce variance further, I decided not to use any items in either condition, although items that automatically circled me or stuck out behind me would at times collide with CPUs or other items. That said, I wouldn't go out of my way to drive into a CPU with shells or bananas, but if it happened while I was attempting to drive my normal lines, that would be fair game. I did attempt to collect the en route coins in both conditions. I also allowed myself to receive boosts from driving behind CPUs, although I did not go out of my way to do this. I only took the boosts if they occurred for me driving my natural lines. My goal was to measure the length of time it took for me, as well as the top-ranking CPU, to complete the race. What this meant is that for each race I was going to win, I had to brake and wait before the finish line so I could time the top CPU. I then had to estimate what my actual finish time would have been by adding on the length of time it would have taken to cross the finish line instead of braking. I will admit there is a chance that rubber banding is more prevalent in other tracks, or perhaps more likely in the much longer races of Knockout Tour. Unfortunately, it would take much more time to gather data over such long races, and it would be more difficult to have a consistent performance from race to race. So although this experiment is limited, it will also be a solid starting point. I decided to start by showing that rubber banding is present at all in the game, and can be found in a single race of Moo Moo Meadows. I did this by simulating the worst driver imaginable. Yep, I turned on auto steering, auto accelerate, and set my controller down. I did 3 trials of this, which I deemed to be enough, and clocked in with an average time of just over 2 minutes 58 seconds. The winning CPU across the 3 races had an average time of just over 2 minutes 41 seconds. With this data in hand, I got to work completing my 10 trials of the racing normally condition. Aside from not using items, this was pretty close to how I drive most of the time. I won the race in 9 out of the 10 trials. When all was said and done, I tallied the results, which I'll share with you here. My average time was 2 minutes 19 and a half seconds, whereas the top CPU time was 2 minutes 25 and a quarter seconds. This was good for an average margin of victory of 5 3/4 seconds. What this told me immediately is yes, rubber banding is indeed present in this game. The top CPU slowed down by nearly 16 seconds when I relied on auto steering. Okay, now that we've established that rubber banding is present, what would we find when I redid the 10 trials without drifting or tricking? How much would I slow down in this condition? And how much would rubber banding cause the CPUs to slow down? If the rubber banding was in fact implemented as poorly as some people claimed, with an overemphasis on how much I drifted and tricked, then it would not surprise us to see my average margin of victory actually increase. Although playing in this style was a little awkward at first, I quickly settled in and started completing some races. It was tough to see a trend at first, but as I completed all 10 trials, the most immediate thing that popped out at me was that I lost 3 of the 10 races, as opposed to just 1 out of 10 when driving normally. But what did the actual data look like? Well, here it is. My average completion time was nearly 2 minutes 25 seconds, about 5.3 seconds slower than in the normal condition. As for the top CPU, its average finishing time increased by about 1.4 seconds to just over 2 minutes 26.5 seconds. My average margin of victory had shrunk from 5.73 seconds down to 1.78 seconds. So what does this tell us? Well, giving it the eyeball test, clearly the races got tighter. My average margin of victory was about 4 seconds larger, or 3.2 times as large, when driving normally versus avoiding drifts and tricks. And the biggest contributor to this was my own finishing time, which was substantially faster when I drifted and tricked. So the concept of driving worse to make things easier on yourself does not hold water, at least when doing it in this manner. But is there rubber banding at all between the two conditions? Well, the top CPU was 1.4 seconds slower, so that's something. But is this due to random chance? Of course, it would help to perform a greater number of trials, but we can still perform some statistical analysis. Analysis that factors the uncertainty from the small number of trials into its result. If we pretend for a moment that my performance had 0 direct impact on the top CPU's performance, which likely isn't true, then we can calculate the p-value. I'll omit a detailed explanation of what that is, but the p-value tells us that there is a 38% chance that this 1.4 second difference occurred due to chance, meaning a 38% chance that there was no rubber banding present between the two conditions. The CPUs drove at the same skill level. But of course, it's not true that the trials across the two conditions were drawn from the same underlying distribution. What I mean by this is the difference in my driving likely had a direct influence on the top CPU time, and this might not be immediately obvious. For example, when I was driving worse, I spent less time in first place. This means that sometimes, a blue shell that otherwise would have hit me ended up hitting the top CPU instead. If this happened even just once every 3 races, this would explain the time discrepancy. So, in my own estimation, I think my impaired driving is more likely to have slowed down the top CPU rather than have sped them up, for reasons having nothing to do with CPU skill or rubber banding. So I'd go somewhere north of the p-value. My personal estimation is there is at least a 50% chance that the CPUs do not drive any worse when you stop drifting and tricking. And even if they do drive any worse, the effect is very small, much smaller than how much your worsened driving harms your own time. I actually think it's worth commending Mario Kart World here. There is clearly rubber banding present, which you can see by looking at the auto steering condition. And this isn't an inherently bad thing for keeping the absolute lowest skilled players engaged. But the rubber banding mostly, if not entirely, melts away by the time you're driving at a reasonable skill level. So there is still every incentive to drive as well as you possibly can. I don't know exactly how the rubber banding was implemented, but it seems to be accomplishing its goal without interfering with higher-end gameplay or presenting opportunities for cheesing. I know what many of you are thinking. This analysis must be flawed. It doesn't match your own observations from Knockout Tour when you get double blue-shelled and hit by several red shells, all while leading in the final lap. Well, as I admitted, rubber banding may work differently on certain tracks or in Knockout Tour. But I also think there is likely a psychological component at play. What I'm getting at is humans have a built-in negativity bias. The irritation of getting blue-shelled right before the finish line and losing a race leaves a much larger impact in your brain than the joy experienced when you're able to catch up and win a race because the leading CPU got blue-shelled. This game likely plays more fairly than many of us perceive. It's just the negativity bias that reinforces our perception of rubber banding. What do you think? Does this match your own observations? Are you willing to collect additional data, perhaps in Knockout Tour, to do an even more thorough analysis? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. And as always, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. Bye for now.